Good morning and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 72nd in the series. This week we're looking at boats, ferries, and in particular the story of one ferry and a tragedy that occurred on that ferry route. If you're new to the series, my name's Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres that cover the whole of the Highlands, that look after historic documents and current documents telling the story of the Highlands. So we have the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, we have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Lochaber Archive Centre in Portree. And together the 4 of those, as I say, make up the Highland Archive Service. If you're new to the series, then it's lovely to have you with us. The purpose of the series is to look at the huge range of collections and stories that appear in those collections that we hold in the Highland Archive Service. If you enjoy this one and you want to go back and have a look at the others, they're all on the High Life Highland YouTube channel or on the Highland Archive Centre Facebook page. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these talks, but if you would like to donate towards our work, we're very grateful for that, and there's a link to be able to do so within the body of the text of this film. This week we're continuing August's theme of transport and travel, following last week's look at railways. This week is pre-recorded, which if you're a regular viewer you'll know is unusual, but as regular viewers will know it's because I'm on leave this week. But please do comment, please do leave feedback. I will see it on my return and other people will see it in the interim, so please do comment. This week, as I said, we're looking at boats, ferries, and the story of the Meikle ferry disaster. It's a very different story to last week's, where I talked about a huge change in technology that drove a transport revolution with the railways. This is a much longer story, a story that goes far further back into our past. Like the rest of the UK, the Highlands has had a long and very important connection to the coast, to the sea, and to all the lochs and rivers that appear within the Highland area. If I remember correctly, I'm sure I was writing an article for the Northern Times newspaper that covers Sutherland, and I found out for that article that there are 300 lochs in the parish of Assynt alone. So that gives you an idea of the huge connection to water we have in the Highlands. And I've touched on this in previous episodes, so if you have been watching for a while, you know I did an episode on the Wick Harbour Trust records. I've done one on the Caledonian Canal collection, and records that relate to our island communities. But I think for a lot of us it's easy to forget how central boats were to daily life for many people in the past, and the recent past as well. Ferry journeys and boat journeys are still central to some in the Highlands, absolutely. There are still the Corran ferry, the Nig Cromarty ferry, there are plenty of examples, but nowhere near as many as there have been in our past. And in our collections we hold a really wide range of records that give an insight into this. So there's everything from references in church minutes and court records, we have photographs of boats, we have letters detailing journeys, we have ferry tickets, we have timetables, all sorts of things. And also we hold archives that document the construction and opening of the bridges that changed everything. So for instance, the Kessick Bridge, the Kyleskew Bridge, the Cromarty Bridge, the Dornoch Bridge, the Skye Bridge are all recent, and I'll come back to that at the end of this. So the relationship with the sea, as we have seen in previous episodes, brings both income and prosperity, but also brings devastation and loss, and a lot of the communities in the Highlands have been shaped by that relationship. I'm going to start with an extract from the 1793 first statistical account for the parish of Edrehillis, and it reads: "What Edrehillis has been and still is happy in, far beyond other parts of the Highlands, is the fishing upon its coast and its many excellent bays and harbours, where shipping of all sizes can enter and moor closely to the land at all hours of the day and night in perfect safety. Of these harbours are Loch Baden, erroneously marked Badwell in some drafts of the coast, Loch Calva, which signifies literally in Gaelic good harbour, Laxford, having several good anchorages, of which Island an Erich or the Irishman's Island is best. Funach Moor, near the entry, is a very safe place. Inchard also has a good harbour, and so has Kyleskew near Stark's Island. There has not only been a greater quantity of fish taken on the coast of this parish for some years past than on any other coast in all the places of the Highlands, but more herring than have been killed on all the coasts of all the Highlands put together. Here there is no person whose sole business is fishing, consequently no fish is sold, excepting herring. Yet every man is a fisher and fishes for himself. Every village and almost every house has a boat, nets, and all sorts of fishing tackle. Yea, some householders have 2 or 3 boats for the answering of different purposes. And it's that final part of almost every house has a boat, and many have 2 or 3 boats to serve different purposes. And so, of course, you can see from that many of the boats that have been part of the Highlands history have been working boats, so either fishing or shipping timber, livestock, or other supplies. In the Alexander Fraser Timber Merchants collection, which I have spoken about in the past, there are huge numbers of documents in that talk about numerous boats leaving Inverness to sail cargoes to Shetland, to London, to Amsterdam, all over. We hold customs and excise collections both at Nucleus and at the Highland Archive Centre, and they document the ships coming in and out of certain ports. They detail each ship's weight, capacity, build material, who the skipper is, who the owner is. Great resources for local history and for family history, but I particularly enjoy them from an escapist point of view. And again, if you've been watching for a while, you'll know I connect very strongly to all of our documents, and they take my head to places far away. These documents, these customs and excise records, give us an insight into thriving local industries, so the herring industry, the timber industry. The pictures that I've shared before on our Facebook page, or if you follow Nucleus's Facebook page, of Wick Harbour in the past, show an entirely different landscape to the one we're familiar with now, with dozens and dozens of boats lined up. And the other thing I love about the customs and excise records is the ships' names. As I say, there's a huge amount of research potential within family history, local history, but other than that, there's just these very expressive and emotive names. So for instance, some have local meaning. There's Dunrobin Castle, Glenmoriston, Lochiel, Clachnacudden. Others have adventurous or inspirational or romantic names. So Peace and Plenty, Lady of the Lake, Cupid, Perseverance, Columbine. One of my favourite things, and please tell me if you do this as well, is to walk around harbours and marinas and to look at the names. And I think that's partly because my dad owned and ran shipping lines for a long time, and there's something about that romance of seeing the names of the boats. Where are they going? What are they going to do? Some of those customs and excise records detail the fate of the boats, so they'll say if they transferred to another owner, if they were lost, if they were wrecked. And sometimes they'll speak of the danger that was faced by ships. And I wanted to read to you something not from the Customs and Excise collection, but actually from our Borough papers from 1715, that talks about the danger of being at sea. This was written after the 1715 Jacobite uprising. We have a huge number of claims that were made by residents of the Highlands against the town council for compensation of things that had been lost to them while the Highlands were in the midst of the Jacobite risings. And this document was written by 2 unsuspecting fishermen who were apprehended at sea and taken to Fortrose by the Jacobites. They had been held prisoner there for 7 days, and this is what their claim for compensation says. Account loss and damages due to David Mullish and Alexander Ross for themselves and in the name of their crew, labouring the boat called the Barbara of Inverness since the late rebellion. From the month of December last, being at sea, coming to this place with a full hoarding of grey fish, we were apprehended at sea by the rebels, and not only brought prisoner with our hoardings to Fortrose, but all our hoardings taken from us, and ourselves kept prisoner 7 days. Our losses, damages and expenses and other damages sustained thereby extends to £24. So it gives you an idea of the danger of just going about your business and being at sea. There are also documents in our collections that talk about ships being held at sea because either there was an infectious disease on the boat or there was on land, and so it was keeping that distance, something that we're so familiar with at the moment, of keeping ships as contained sort of microcosms away from other people. Ships, of course, have always transported people away from and people to our shores in Scotland. And we hold documents that record that experience, the experience of emigrants leaving, facing the physical issues of sickness, the emotional issues of heartache, loneliness, fear, and excitement in pursuit of a new life. I'm not going to go any further into that subject because I have a Learn with Lorna coming up in September looking specifically at stories of migration, and it will be, I'm sure, a very interesting one. She says, I did not mean it like that, but I'm sure it will be because the documents are so very powerful. But what about the experience of people in boats travelling around the Highlands? I wanted to read to you. It's quite a long document, but it's an absolutely fantastic letter by my favourite man in the collections, William Fraser Tytler. I think I've referred to this letter before, but I don't think I've actually read it to you. And so this is a description of a journey that William took. He was the sheriff's substitute for the county, so he travelled round Inverness-shire, going to court cases. And this is a letter that he wrote to his wife, Margaret, from Portree in September 1832 when he arrived there. My dearest love, if you know anything of the geography of these islands, my dating from this place today would not surprise you, would not a little surprise you, and much reason have we, my darling, to return thanks to Almighty God that I am here safe and well, for we have made a narrow escape indeed from shipwreck. On the 12th it blew so heavy a gale that Captain Beatson could not venture out of Dunvegan Bay, and we spent an as unpleasant a day in a bad inn, made worse by the insolence of the landlady. Smoke and dirt inside, and rain and wind driving through the windows and the doors from without. We were at Dunvegan for 2 days. On Friday morning the wind had moderated a little, though still very strong, and we sailed about 5 o'clock. But just as we cleared Dunvegan Head, it began to blow again. Not a steady, strong breeze, but desperate squalls and a cross and heavy sea. We got on, however, and by 10 o'clock were off the Long Island, when the wind changed right ahead, still blowing great guns. For 3 hours we made every attempt that a gallant little vessel, as firm as iron, well commanded and nobly manned, could make, to gain the entrance to Lochmaddy, little more than a mile ahead, but it was all in vain. 2 jibs were carried away in succession. One was rent from top to bottom, not by the wind, but by the stroke of a heavy sea which broke over us, though there was a bulwark nearly 4 foot high around the whole deck. All our guns were under water, and so also every now and then was the bowsprit to the very keel, and at every plunge we expected to see it snapped over by the bows. The captain sent down to me to say that he had nothing but a small jib left, which though he could go before the wind, he could never set up against such a gale as was ahead, and he must either make for Harris or endeavour to gain Snizort Bay. The latter was clearly preferable from the public service, and was ordered accordingly, and back we again went through the same heavy sea in the Minch, which had used us so scarily. But with the wind in our favour we dashed through it in great style, and 3 hours brought us to Snizort Head. We had just rounded it, when the weather became more tempestuous than ever. The rain fell in torrents, and the squalls of wind came furiously off the head. The most vivid flashes of lightning accompanied the thunder, so close that there was not a second of interval between the flash and the clap, was followed by one squall so furious that many of the crew were thrown down. McQueen, who was on the opposite side of the cabin, was pitched right across to the other, and if his head, instead of going right into one of the berths, had met with a panel, he would probably have had his neck broken. Even in this state it was impossible not to laugh at the manner in which Shepherd's terrors were expressed, for he so far forgot himself as to roar out his orders to the crew in a voice intended to drown the captain's and the gale too. This, however, was the last of our danger. We were now under the lee of a high shore. He goes on to describe the experiences, how frightened they had been, and the fact that various members of the crew and the passengers had been sick, had been physically sick, had been frightened, that the captain had come in as soaked as a giant river dog. But it's a very, very descriptive letter, I think, of that experience of the wind and the rain. And it goes on to say that when they finally landed, they walked 9 miles in the torrential rain to Portree, so happy to find ourselves on terra firma to think much of this addition to the adventure. We had in going and returning sailed upwards of 50 miles, and this with our walk made as complete a day's work from my 5 guineas as I could ever do. So just that very descriptive letter to his wife describing what the experience had been like, and that description of McQueen being flung across the cabin, and if he hadn't landed on the bed he would have smashed his head open. And there are other documents from our collections that talk about that, compound that image of rough seas and long dangerous journeys which were entirely weather dependent. So for instance, in our school logbook collections which sit within our local government records, there are school logbooks, for instance, from Skerry School that talk about attempted visits to Island Roan and how many times the teacher had to put off visiting the school because it was so dependent on the tides and the weather. And of course, I think one of the other things we forget about is that at this point we had a huge number of people overseas for one reason or another, and all of the deliveries of mail went by ship. And so we find numerous references in our collections to letters that say, I sent you a previous letter by this boat, but I think the boat went down so you wouldn't have got it. And I find that really fascinating, to think of all the documents we don't have because they went astray at sea. A very interesting thing to think about, I think. So that's a little bit about how boats are represented in some of our collections. What about the ferries that plied their trade around the coast? I'll come on to ferries in just a second, after I've reminded you that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. Now, the stories of ferries and ferrymen are, again, hundreds of years old, and there have been so many ferries across the Highlands because there are so many places where the alternative was a very long road diversion. And there are many still in various places. So I mentioned the Corran Ferry earlier. There are various other ones that are still in operation to prevent those huge diversions round the coastline. If you're interested in finding out about the early days of the ferries in the Highlands, then I would really recommend that you look up Dr. David Worthington. Dr. David Worthington is the head of the history department at the University of the Highlands and Islands, a good friend of the Archive Service, and he's done some very detailed research into this subject and into the early stories of ferries. So if you're interested, then I would recommend you have a look for his name. But I wanted to read one example, the statistical account from 1793 from the parish of Urquhart, to show the extent that ferries were the norm across the Highlands at that period. So this is under the section entitled Ferries, etc. There are 2 or 3 ferries in this parish. One of them is at its eastern extremity opposite to Fowles, from whence it has its name. This is not a much frequented ferry, and it's incommodious at low water from the shallowness of the shore. Towards the west end of the parish, on the river of Connan and beyond where the tide at any time flows, is the ferry of Scuddale, on the post road from Bewley to Dingwall. Beside these ferries there is a small boat for foot passengers, which at high water plies between Dingwall and Ferrintosh. On the tides retiring, and when the river is not high, there is access to Dingwall from this side of the water by different fords. Some of these fords have a zigzag direction, which they retain amidst partial variations, to which all of them are very subject from the united force of high tides and frequent swellings of the river. These circumstances, together with the rapid flowing of the tide at particular times, render this a hazardous passage which proves fatal to many. Since the settlement of the present minister in 1774, scarce a year has passed without the loss of some life on it. Some years it has brought 2, 3, or more to an untimely end. Within the course of 14 months, about 8 years ago, 7 persons perished in crossing the water of Connan at different places within the limits of the parish. Humanity strongly solicits the long-promised public aid for erecting a bridge on this river, in which the hopes and supports of many families have fallen by a premature fate. So that just shows not only the danger of the ferry journeys, which we'll come back to, but just the sheer commonness of them within that small area, to have 2 or 3 ferries, one not used very much, one used regularly, one that's very dangerous, a bigger one, a smaller one. And it's the same right across the Highlands, but in the parish of Tongue. I was writing an article recently about the parish of Tongue, and that talks about a ferry that there was two boats to cross the Kyle, and it was a big boat and a smaller boat. One would take livestock, one would take carts, and you had to signal for the ferry to travel backwards and forwards. The other thing that can show the commonness of ferries is just a glance at the maps. So for instance, Loch Inch, Kincraig, an area I know very well, it's where I grew up, was called, before it was called Kincraig, that part of the area was called Boat of Inch and Boat of Inch Ferry. Situated at the north end of Loch Inch, and the Ordnance Survey namebook says Inch Kincraig, Boat of Inch Ferry situated at the north end of Loch Inch. Passengers and livestock of any description can be conveyed over. It is a public ferry, the property of Sir G. Macpherson Grant Ballandalloch. It's also interesting for anyone else watching who does know that area that the Ordnance Survey namebook also records that there was previously a small country inn with a farmsteading attached, 1 story high, slated and in good repair, situated at the north end of Loch Inch on the east side near the church, and the ferry boat is conducted by the tenant. And there's no sign of that now in the landscape, although some old postcards do exist that show the building. But it just goes to show that's just one example of the places where a ferry has been absolutely central to a community. But as soon as the bridge was built, there was no need for it, and it lives on only in certain documents like maps. In some places, the ferry name lives on. So, for instance, Boat of Garton is still called Boat of Garton. There are various places called Ferry House. There's a part of Inverness called the Ferry. So you can still see it in some place names. And as I mentioned, many of the ferries do exist. So, for instance, there's a ferry that goes from Fort William to Camagale. There's the Nig Cromarty ferry, which has run for hundreds of years. A 15-minute crossing across the Cromarty Firth that prevents the need for a 40-mile road journey. Today, that 40-mile road journey would be an inconvenience, but in the past would have been an absolutely insurmountable issue for some people, or a journey that would have taken so much more planning and time and cost. And of the ferries that no longer exist, many of them have only gone in recent memory. Some have even gone in my memory. The Kessick Ferry, which travelled between Inverness and North Kessick for many, many, many years, only ended in 1982 with the opening of the Kessick Bridge. So many, I'm sure, watching will remember that, because it's not even 40 years ago. It's just very slightly older than me. And one of the boats that had served, the Rosehawk, on the Kessick Ferry route, went on to serve on the Corran Ferry, which, as I said, still exists near Fort William. The Kessick Ferry wasn't the only one in the area. There had been one from Ardishere to Fortrose. There was one across the Cromarty Firth, one across the Dornoch Firth, several in and around Bewley, as we heard in that extract, and then dozens more across the Highlands. According to a booklet that we hold in Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives, it is recalled that up to the year 1730, John de Groat was the ferry boatman for passengers wishing to cross to Orkney. His charge for the crossing was 4pence, usually a fourpenny bit, a small coin slightly larger than a threepenny bit, called a groat. This story is from the pen of Dr. John Morrison, Minister of Canisby, written in the year 1782. He states that he can vouch for its authenticity, as the particulars were given to him by a friend whose father had seen the actual letter given to the Groats by King James IV. If that's correct, then that means that the ferry that ran from John o' Groats to Orkney has been running for around 300 years, and it still runs today during the summer. So there's evidence everywhere for this huge number of ferries that ran, and we hold documents relating to many of them across our 4 offices. So, for instance, we hold the minute books of the management of some of them, we hold schedules of rates for others, photographs, maps that show the routes, tickets and timetables, and within our Borough Minutes and County Minutes series, we hold references to the construction of piers and things like that. For some of those ferries, it was the advent of faster roads and faster cars that brought about their end. It was interesting, as I was preparing for this, I was speaking to my line manager, and she was talking about always going to Glasgow from Inverness via the Ballachulish ferry, because the A9 wasn't as good a road as it is now, and so that was an easier route to take. And so for some it was that development of the faster roads and faster cars that changed it, but for many it was the construction of bridges. And many of the major bridges in the Highlands which replaced the ferry crossings are really, really recent. So I mentioned the Kessick Bridge was 1982, the Cromarty Bridge was 1979, and the Dornoch Bridge 1991, and together those 3 made up the project called the Bridging of the Three Firths. The Ballachulish Bridge was 1975 and Kyleskew 1984. And those 5 bridges are cut off a huge amount of journey time and were all done in recent memory. The Skye Bridge, of course, opened in 1995, and that was a controversial bridge from the moment it was proposed. We hold construction records, aerial photos, opening booklets, scrapbooks from school pupils who attended the opening of these bridges, and records of protest that talk about local people or others giving their opinion about why the bridge should not go ahead. I wanted to share some of these thoughts written by Uig primary school pupils in 1987 about the proposed new Skye Bridge replacing the long-running ferry. So this is from 4 school pupils in a primary school. First one says, "Many people think that a bridge to Skye would be better than a ferry. Some say it would be faster and safer. True enough, though no one can say for sure that the bridge will be safer until it's built. I agree with the people against the bridge because Skye would no longer be a proper island." The next one says, "Sometimes ambulances might need to get across to the mainland quick and the boat can't get across because of a storm, and they can't go back because Portree and Broadford hospitals don't have the stuff the patient needs. But I think there should always be a boat because Skye has always had a boat, so why change it now?" Another one says it would spoil the look of the island, and say a man murdered a girl. He could get away if there was a bridge. Police can catch people at the ferry. Another one, "If Skye decided to have a bridge, what would the poor Kyleakin pensioners do? They'd have a long way to walk over to the bridge to Kyle to get their shopping." Really interesting, all the different considerations there of children, the impact on older people, the fact that the fear that something might happen on the island and the police wouldn't be able to catch people because there would be this escape route now with the bridge. But the thought of the hospitals, the thought of, well, maybe it would be quicker and safer. Really interesting. And you can see a huge amount of loyalty to the ferry in those answers. But I wanted to finish this week's episode by sharing the story of a particular ferry and a particular ferry tragedy, the Meikle Ferry. The Meikle Ferry followed a line roughly 200 metres west of the present-day Dornochfirth Bridge. For hundreds of years it was the only crossing between Sutherland and Rossshire that didn't require a long detour. But in 1809, this busy ferry route became the scene of an absolute tragic and horrific disaster. In the collections of the Highland Archive Centre, we hold the Meikle Ferry Disaster Fund book, and it opens like this. On the forenoon of Wednesday the 16th day of August, 1809 years, a most calamitous and awful accident happened on the Meikle Ferry, twixt the counties of Sutherland and Ross. The passage boat having on board 113 persons of both sexes besides 3 ferrymen, on their way from the town and parish of Dornoch and neighbouring parishes to the Lammas Fair in Tain, in consequence of being imprudently overloaded. The boat sunk or upset when about 100 yards from the bank on the Sutherland side from whence they set out. It was a disaster on an absolutely unprecedented scale in that part of the world. So you heard in that extract there were 114 people on board. Of those 114, 91 of the passengers and crew died. There were dozens of families left destitute, including the ferryman's wife and his 9 children. The book is very emotional to read, and Jenny, I'm aware that you always comment when I read out the names of people who've lost their lives. I won't be able to read out the names of all of those people, but they do exist. The book records that it was impossible to convey by description an adequate picture of the heart-rending scene which followed in this parish and vicinity, upon which the calamity chiefly fell. Within days a fund had been set up to raise money for the bereaved and to help them search for the bodies of the people who had been lost, and I think that's particularly touching. It's to raise money to support them going forward, but also the importance of trying to search for the bodies of the people they'd lost. Captain Robert Sutherland of Dramui was in the chair of this group. Before a public appeal even went out, the book records that the officers, the non-commissioned officers and the privates of the East Ross Regiment of Local Militia had, in the most handsome manner, each contributed a day's pay to the cause. The public appeal went out with the reminder that there was scarcely a family that has not to lament a child, parent or other relative. And money came in from across the Highlands and across the world, from Goa, from South Africa, from India, from Demerara. And the reason we know that is because, and I said there that the names of the people who died are known. I may be incorrect in that. What is known is the details of those people who benefited from the fund and the details of the people who contributed. And in the end, the fund raised £3,400 and it was distributed amongst those who had been affected by the Meikle Ferry disaster. The Meikle Ferry Disaster Fund book, or Meikle Ferry Disaster Fund, is believed to have been one of the first, if not the first, fund in the whole world created specifically to raise money for people who have been affected by a disaster. And every time I look at it, aside from being just desperately sad for the impact that must have had on the community, it reminds me of people's compassion for others when they're faced with a crisis. And I think we see that all the time. You know, there is a lot of good in people and there's a lot of compassion in people that we see when others are facing a disaster and a crisis. And that's one of the reasons I am so glad this book survives and exists. If you're in the area or coming to the area, there is a memorial on the site. You can go down to Meikle Ferry. There's a cairn there at the side of the water. I hope you've enjoyed that. I know I've finished on a sad note, but also a note of hope, I think, about people's compassion and care for each other. I hope you've enjoyed it, learning a little bit about some of the boats and ferries that have plied their trade around the waters of the Highlands. Thank you for joining me. Next week I will be back in person in real life, and I will be talking about the life of Christina Keith, academic, author and World War I army educator. So I really hope you can join me for that. But in the meantime, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna films. But if you're able to donate towards our work and allow us to continue to look after, preserve and collect these records, then we would very much appreciate that. Thank you.